Oh, so welcome, Brennen. Thanks for being with us
Great.
today.
Make sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a lot of fun. Obviously, I'm really excited about this, and I'm a super nerd, so it's really nice to find other people who are excited about it as well. I'll give you a quick introduction to me and my background, and then I'll, based on some of the questions that we got beforehand, I'll talk a little bit about aging, kind of in general, probably just 5-10 minutes, and then hopefully this will be more of a conversation than a presentation. Let me go ahead and hop on over here. So I did my, I'm skipping the step. Emma will remember where I did a master's in animal behavior many, many years ago. I actually worked with primates. I did a research project doing enrichment for the chimpanzees at the San Francisco Zoo. We actually just lost Kabi, who's one of the oldest chimpanzees in captivity in the US at 63. And I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with them. So that was sad for me. But trying to be Jane Goodall proved not as effective a career path as I'd hoped. So instead, I ended up going to veterinary school at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been working at Adobe Animal Hospital, which is a small animal practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been in practice about 20 years. I've been at Adobe for 17 years, so I've been in the same place for a really long time. And I do dogs, cats, rabbits, and rodents, and I love clinical practice. I'm also, because I'm a nerd, I like to keep learning new stuff, and so I'm always going back and doing new things. One activity that I was very involved with for a long time was the Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association. I was president of that for a while. And it's a group of veterinarians in practice and in research trying to help veterinary medicine be more science-based and evidence-based, because unfortunately, with the shortage of research information that we have to deal with, we're often sort of stuck with doing the best we can based on our personal experience or our habits or whatever our mentor taught us when we were young vets. And those are not always the most reliable foundations for good clinical practice. So I was very involved in trying to make that connection between basic science and clinical medicine and help to make medicine more effective and more science-based. That led me to blogging. I've been running the Skeptvet blog for about 10 years. It did start, as mentioned, with a lot of stuff about alternative medicine. It's kind of broadened beyond that, but that was where I started. Mostly it was just a place for me to take things that I learned in trying to help answer questions for my clients and offer them to the rest of the world and say, well, here's what I found out. Here's what I think, would be useful to know about this subject, and I'll share it with you. And that's expanded to, all the social media things, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of that kind of stuff. Eventually, that led me to writing the book, which we've already mentioned. And that's kind of a distillation of things that I've learned over the years. Partly about alternative therapies, but actually mostly just about how we think about what we choose to do for our pets or our patients. If you're a vet, how do we know what works and what doesn't work? How does the unique set of things that happen in our brains when we try to understand the world play into how we make decisions about what therapies we should try or shouldn't try? There's a really interesting bit of psychology and philosophy behind science and behind knowing what works and what doesn't work. And that's a large part of what the book's about. That led me on to doing a master's in epidemiology in a human public health school. I had to do that one online. My wife said that I had to keep working full time, so I had to do that one part-time online. And that's the thesis that I never got around to publishing, but I learned an awful lot about how we do research and how we do it wrong sometimes in veterinary medicine. And it's really been helpful to me in critically thinking about the evidence when I try to decide as a clinician in practice, what to offer my patients and what not to do. And then about 6 or 7 months ago, I started working for Loyal. And Loyal is a biotechnology startup, very small company out here in the Bay Area. And our mission is aging in dogs, trying to understand how aging works and trying to develop therapies to help slow or maybe even reverse the aging process and the impact of dog aging on health. And I also play the mandolin, so something unusual about me. I think the first thing I always start with is, what does aging really mean? It's one of those funny things that it happens to all of us, and it's certainly happening to me. So we feel like we know what it is, But when you start to get into the nitty-gritty of defining aging, it's actually trickier than it sounds. Aging is a series of changes that happen to us and to our pets over time. But, time isn't really the main thing that drives those changes, oddly enough. We like to talk in the aging business about the difference between chronological age, or the number of years that a dog's been alive, and biological age, how old they are physically or behaviorally. And there can be a real difference. A 6-year-old Irish Wolfhound is not the same age as a 6-year-old Yorkie or Toy Poodle. There are differences in how dogs age based on breed and size and lots of other things. And even among individuals within a breed, everybody ages a little differently. And so one of the things we're doing at Loyal is trying to find better ways of understanding how old is a dog really, at what stage in their life cycle are they biologically, not just how many years have they been with us. Kind of a classic definition of aging that works well enough for everyday use is from this paper back in the 1980s. It's basically the accumulation of things over time that changes your health and reduces your resilience and your strength to the point where you become more susceptible to disease and eventually die. And we all know that, but I think that it turns out the details are a lot more interesting and complicated than the general idea. One of the most common questions that people emailed in, before this chat was, how do I know that my dog is aging? What do I expect to see? And this is kind of one of the ways that I like to break down what aging looks like in dogs. Some of it is about how they look. I mean, you can tell that a dog is a puppy or not a puppy or an old dog pretty well by looking at it. There are pretty predictable changes, and a lot of them are the same ones that happen to people. Their hair color changes, their eyes get cloudy, they get wrinkly. There are a lot of things that happen on the outside that you can see. There are also lots of physical changes that are consistent, that happen to most dogs as they get older, but that happen on the inside and that we can't see. So you can look at how their kidneys function or how their liver or lungs look and see changes associated with aging. So some of it is the visible stuff. A lot of it is physical function, how they're able to do things. Dogs, just like people, get weaker and have more trouble getting around and may have pain and mobility problems. They may not hear as well. They may not have as much energy or be as active as they get older. And those are all fairly common physical changes that occur with aging. One of the most noticeable to people, to pet parents is, of course, all the lumps and bumps they get, from little warts to the big lipomas that you sometimes see, and to more potentially serious things like cancers. But growing lumps tends to be something that marks aging in dogs. And that's one of those biological aging things that happens at different times in different dogs. So it's not just the passage of time, but other things going on physiologically that makes that happen. And, Emma is going to be much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but obviously there are behavior changes. Our dogs act differently as they get older. And there's a lot of debate and discussion about, what is normal and what is disease. And that's a controversial area, but there are definitely consistent patterns in how animals get older. And at some point, sometimes we call those things a disorder, and sometimes we just call them normal aging, depending on which side of that argument you come down on. But a lot of them are fairly common. Again, being less active, being less interested in social interactions, maybe being more anxious or nervous about things than they used to be. And some of the more dramatic things that you see that we often label cognitive dysfunction, where they get lost in the house or they have house training issues. These are very complicated, but there are definitely some consistent patterns. And then finally, there are actual diseases, health problems that are associated with age. And arthritis is an obvious one. The ones that I put on this list are actually, in most of the research that's out there currently, probably the top 5 causes of death in dogs, right? These are diseases of aging, and they're also the reason why we lose our dogs. And so these are an important part of the aging process. Now, we all have heard the whole thing about, a year in a dog's life is 7 years in a human life. And I think people are pretty wise to the fact now that that's not super reliable anymore. But the fact is that dogs and humans age really similarly. We have a very similar pattern in our life cycle. It's just the speed at which things happen is a little bit different. So this is from a study looking at epigenetic markers, looking at changes in DNA, not in the genes themselves, but in other parts of the DNA that occur over time. and that can be used sometimes as a proxy for biological or chronological age, depending on how you use them. And what they show us is there is a relationship between how we get older and how our dogs get older. It's not a simple one-to-one relationship, because dogs grow up a lot faster than we do at the beginning, and they tend to grow old and fail a lot faster at the end. In the middle, they tend to be stable and steady in the way that looks very similar to what sort of adulthood and middle age look like in people. So there's a relationship there, and you can express it in a complicated formula, but basically the beginning and end of the life cycle seem to be compressed in dogs relative to humans, but the general pattern of how we age is really remarkably similar. Now, even that is, of course, an oversimplification. And one of the things we talk a lot about at Loyal, and one of our focuses in terms of our research, is the difference between how dogs of different sizes age. We think we all understand that bigger dogs tend to have shorter lives than smaller dogs. And you can see this not only in lifespan data, but in physiologic data, looking at their epigenetics, at their telomeres, at all kinds of markers or biomarkers of aging. So some people try to take this relationship between human aging and dog aging and make it a little bit more precise based on what we know about the lifespan of dogs of different size. So that also is sometimes interesting to people to think about, how old is my dog, not only in terms of how old I would be, but how old relative to a dog of a different size. Age is not destiny, right? So all that tells us is kind of roughly what we should be thinking about or be aware of or be expecting. But of course, even within breeds, there's a lot of individual variation in how dogs age. Why are we interested in aging? I think if I have one message that I want everyone always to take away when we talk about these things, is that aging is not a mysterious and inevitable process that we just have to put up with. Aging is biology. Aging is a bunch of things that happen in the body that we can understand and that lead to health problems and eventually to death. So what I like to think of it in terms that work well for vets and for doctors is it's a modifiable risk factor for disease. We talk about risk factors that we can control and things we can't, right? You can't control the genes you're born with, but you can control whether you exercise, whether you smoke, things like that. Aging is actually a modifiable risk factor. If we understand how aging happens and all the processes involved, we can probably find ways to alter it. And in doing so, what's really cool is that we can potentially change the risk for a whole bunch of diseases that superficially don't seem related to each other, right? Behavioral disease and cancer and heart disease and kidney disease. We tend as veterinarians to think of them as all different things and treat them very differently. But you can trace their origins to common processes that are part of aging. So the real potential here for aging biology is understanding how it provides a risk factor that can be changed for a whole bunch of different diseases. There's some interesting research looking at, what we would achieve in humans if we, for example, completely cured all cancers, and how much life expectancy would we add to the population. And it tends to be less than you'd think. But if we address aging, which is the underlying cause for a lot of different diseases, we have a potentially huge impact. Now that's down the road a ways. We're not there yet, but I think it's a really encouraging possibility. The other thing that makes aging worth studying is that it impacts people and their pets quite a bit, right? Obviously, the changes that come with age tend to diminish the quality of life for our dogs and for us as well. And there are costs, there are financial costs, there are emotional burdens that come with having pets who are older and have chronic disease. And anything that we can do to relieve that burden for our pets and for us is worth pursuing. This is a fancy little chart that I like. Probably it's taken me a long time to make it, but also because I think it illustrates the difference between what we call lifespan and health span. Lifespan, everybody knows, right? That's just the number of years that you live. Health span is not a word that I think gets used very often, but it's a nice coinage because what it gets at is the number of years you live without significant disability or disease. And that's really what we're interested in. We know we don't want to make ourselves and our dogs older if it just means we get to be sick longer. What would be the point of that, right? So health span is the period of time of good health that you experience in your life. And a big focus of aging biology and aging research is increasing health span. So this just shows sort of the life cycle, right? You start at birth and you end at death, and we're not going to probably change that. There's a really rapid period of time when puppies are growing where they become stronger and more functional and more resistant to disease and generally more resilient. And they hit their peak in young adulthood. And physically speaking, that's as strong and resilient as they're going to get. And then they go somewhere from there. And eventually that somewhere ends up with, health problems and death. But what does that trajectory look like? If it's very sharp and very straight, then by the time you get to middle age, you start to have some health issues. And by the time you're, pretty darn old for your breed, you've got a lot of disability and a lot of discomfort. If we can shift that over, if we can impact aging and the processes behind aging that lead to disease so that we compress that period of disability and disease to as small a fraction of the life cycle as possible, even if we don't extend lifespan, we'd love to do that, but even if we don't extend lifespan, we've made the quality of life better. And that's a big point that I feel like is really important. We won't be doing any good if we extend lifespan without improving health span. Historically, we've done a great job extending lifespan for people and for dogs. Most of that has been by getting rid of the causes of death that occur early in life, right? Infectious disease, things we could prevent with vaccines, with sanitation, with nutrition. So we live longer. We've had less success at dealing with the things that happen to you as you get old. We've had some, but health span hasn't increased nearly as much as lifespan has. So that's a big part of my interest in my work, is how do we make dogs live healthier as well as longer? And the reason why I think we can do this is because we know an awful lot about how aging works. And this is a very popular chart that shows up from all over the place when you talk about aging, because it comes from a paper that basically categorized the underlying mechanisms of aging. And the details of this aren't important. There are changes in genes, in metabolism, in mitochondria, anything you guys are interested in, I'm happy to talk about. But the bottom line is there are mechanisms behind this. We can understand them. And if we can understand them, potentially we can manipulate them. We already know that we can extend both lifespan and health span with fairly straightforward changes. This is just a comparison of caloric restriction studies and changes in some hormone values in a variety of different species. One of the cool things about aging is that it works very, very similarly across species. There are a lot of things, we use mice and flies and worms as models for medicine. And there are a lot of things in which they don't make great models for people or for dogs because they're very different from us. But in terms of aging, it's amazing how similar the aging processes are across very different species. So one of the simplest things you can do is feed animals significantly less, and you see dramatic increases not only in the length of life, but also in the time in which they're healthy. And that's been shown in dogs as well as in other species. This is from a study done from the late 1980s up into the early 2000s by Purina, where they took a group of dogs. They had paired litter mates. One litter mate basically got to eat pretty much what they wanted. These are Labrador retrievers, so you can imagine they love that. The other litter mate was fed about 25% less. And over the time of the study, they followed the dogs all the way through their entire lifetime until all the dogs passed away. And the dogs who were fed less, who were in the calorie restriction group, lived almost 2 years longer, which is great. But they also showed significant delay in the onset of all kinds of age-related diseases. This is just one, looking at the hip joints in particular and arthritis in the hips. And you can see that they still developed arthritis. We didn't make this problem go away. What we did is we delayed the time at which it came and the pace at which it occurred and progressed so that we extended both the length of their life and their health span or the quality of life. And that was just by restricting the number of calories about 25% from what they would have chosen to eat if they'd been able to do what they wanted, right? Pretty dramatic results. So we already know that we can affect aging. Now, probably a simpler thing to do, ideally, is to feed your dogs so they don't get overweight. I think realistically, we all understand that extreme calorie restriction is just not practical, right? Where food is love. Food is how we express affection and bond with our pets, and we're not going to force them to eat dramatically less, for that extra return in health and lifespan. But we also all know, and as a vet, as I get on my soapbox for a second, obesity is a huge health problem in dogs. And if we can even feed them to a decent, ideal, reasonable body weight, there's great evidence in humans and a little bit of evidence in dogs that we can have a significant impact on their aging process and on their health and life. Fat is not just a place to store calories. It's actually a metabolically active tissue that does a whole lot of stuff. And a lot of that stuff is not good for us in the long term. And then I was just going to say a quick word about a couple of things that people can do, and we'll talk more about this if you want, if you're interested in getting more involved in aging. So now I already mentioned the Dog Aging Project. I was actually involved in this before I went to work at Loyal or really had anything to do with aging, because I just thought it sounded so cool. This is a project that some academics, Matt Kaberlein and Daniel Promislow, who are in the aging field, and Kate Creevy at Texas A&M, basically are collecting information about tens of thousands of dogs. You can sign your dog up on the website, fill out some questionnaires, maybe send them medical records, and they're trying to just look as broadly as possible at how dogs age. And then potentially later down the road, there are going to be some more involved clinical trials, things that involve taking blood samples or DNA samples. I know they're looking at a drug called rapamycin, which we can talk about, which is a hot topic in the aging field, and they're going to do some clinical studies with dogs in that. So this is just an easy way for you as sort of citizen scientists to get involved in looking at aging. My company as well, Loyal, is currently doing an observational study where we're basically looking at a couple different ways of measuring aging in dogs to see if we really understand how dogs age and we can measure it accurately, so that at some point later down the road, if we have therapies that we want to test, we know how we want to test those. And so this is something that you could participate in if you happen to be near one of our sites. We've got about 9 sites. I think the only one in New York is at Cornell, but you can look on the website. There's a map of where some of the sites are. There'll be other studies going on later as well. And there are lots of other things. The Morris Animal Foundation, Golden Retriever study is a great one to look at aging. I've been an investigator and have several of my patients in their study for a while. That one's not enrolling anymore, but they're producing really interesting information all the time. Loyal actually is doing a genetic analysis project with them, so we're partnered with Morris. So there's a lot of stuff going on. This is really a hot moment in the aging field. And if you get the opportunity to be involved in any way with your pets, I definitely encourage you to do it, because that's what we need, right? We need people to be interested and involved in this so that we can learn. And I think that is it for me. I will see if I can stop sharing my screen. And then I'm happy to just talk or take questions.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. We're having a conversation in the chat here that
yeah, I was trying to keep track of that. My brain can only do so many things at once. So talking and reading at the same time is still a challenge for me.
No worries. We tend to be a bit of a talkative crew. But folks, if you have questions, I see Shelly has one. So go ahead, unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, so my background, I'm kind of like Emma in the sense that I have some animal behavior training, but I also have done a bunch of stuff with like evolutionary anthropology. So that's the lens I'm coming from and asking this question. I've seen the research on how restricted diets work. And I read Herman Poncer's book, Burn, recently. So I'm thinking about energetics, and I'm wondering what you know behind the why it works. Of course, it's going to help joints if you keep a leaner body. But especially in those, the equivalent in humans is like 60 plus. And I'm sure with dogs, we could come up with the general age range of the equivalent. But why is it that later in life, it's so helpful to try to pull back on those calories?
Yeah, so from an evolutionary point of view, which is, I'll start with that, because there's the physiological point of view, right? We can talk about AMPK and mTOR and all of the physiologic pathways. That's not as much my area of expertise, but I think we have a pretty well worked out set of pathways in caloric restriction and what they trigger. But from an evolutionary point of view, my understanding of it is that essentially you have a set of stress response mechanisms in your body that are designed to maintain the soma, right? Maintain the body itself. And the long-term goal of evolution, of course, is reproduction, right? Reproductive success is the measure of success from an evolutionary point of view. So if you are in a rich environment which has got all the calories and all the nutrients in the world and not a lot of, dangers and stressors, you're supposed to have as many babies as you can, as fast as you can, because they're all going to grow up and survive anyway. And that's what, your system will be geared towards doing. If, however, you're in an environment in which, calories are sparse and it's hard to maintain yourself, that strategy is not going to work. You have a bunch of babies, they're all going to die. You're not devoting enough energy and attention to your own survival, so you're not going to live very long, and your reproductive success is going to go down. So instead, you take a longer term strategy where, you have a slower reproductive process, you put more investment into, individual offspring, and you put more investment into maintaining yourself and your own mechanisms of homeostasis so that you're then there to go through the long term. It's a little bit like the old idea of R-selected and K-selected species, right? That different species fit into different life cycles. I mean, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, I think, that we're kind of moving away from, but it's the same general idea. So it turns out that within reason, stressors are good for you. So if you exercise, that's a form of stress. And we used to say, well, if you run too much, you wear out your knees. Turns out the more you run, within reason, the more you stimulate repair mechanisms and reduce inflammation and do a whole bunch of things that keep your knees functional. So people who run maintain function and health and reduce the risk of osteoarthritis, which is counterintuitive, but it's because mild to moderate stressors stimulate regeneration and repair mechanisms. And calorie restriction is a kind of stressor that does that. There are also some other ideas about how it works. For example, if you lower your basal metabolic rate, you probably lower the production of reactive oxygen species and free radicals, and then you have less oxidative damage, which is one of the mechanisms of aging. So there are some other things involved. But from an evolutionary point of view, it seems like it's your body's way of essentially reacting to lean times and giving you a longer opportunity to continue engaging in reproduction when you need to. And the problem that we all have is that we're all selected to seek out sugar, salt, and fat, because those are the things that were rare and hard to come by in our ancestors' environment. And now they're bloody everywhere. And it's hard for us to avoid them. And we end up with a lot of chronic disease because of our lifestyle. So, that's, I think, the short and dirty version of the evolutionary explanation.
I appreciate that, and especially the helping make the connection of the analogy that you made with arthritis and lubing the joints, kind of finding that balance between stressing them too much and stressing them enough. That makes a lot more sense now. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, the old wear and tear theory of aging is one that we've moved away from, and I'm old enough to remember, when people would say with a straight face, you only got so many heartbeats. You go for a run, you use up a bunch of them, and you're going to run out sooner. And that is not how physiology works, right? But it took us a while to prove that.
Use it or lose it, right, Doc?
Absolutely. Yep.
I remember that phrase. So this also sounds a bit like how I kind of live my life a little bit more, where intermittent faster, if you will. I pretty much eat like 1.5 meals, and I noticed my pup, he's not a pup anymore according to your chart, he's 30 years old. He also eats like a big meal at dinner. So I'm trying to figure this out. I got a little Yorkie. I'm also a neighbor. I don't know which one location you're in, Los Altos or Marin or somewhere.
Yeah, I'm down on the peninsula. So not too far away, other side of the bay.
And I'm registering my pup for Loyal right now. I'm in the middle of that. So my question is, how do I figure out the numbers? Is it like there's a formula for how much he weighs, his breed, like the calories? Like I feel like I need a whole Notion system or some sort of app to help me with figuring out these numbers so I know what I'm doing right. Because I just let him eat what he wants and then he stops eating. I'm like, he's done.
Yeah. No, so there are a couple of things to think about there. One is, we don't know all the answers, right? So we know that calorie restriction affects health and life. We have some evidence for different feeding patterns, which is a different thing. Like intermittent fasting might turn out to be as effective and easier to do than global calorie restriction, but we haven't done a lot of studies on that yet. So there's still stuff we don't know. The other thing is, and this is me speaking more as a clinician than an aging researcher, every dog is different. And when I plug them into that formula and it tells me how many calories they need to eat, the error bars around that number are about 100% either way. They're enormous, right? Because everybody's metabolic rate and activity level and all of that stuff is different. So my advice would be not to get too hung up on numbers, because I think they give you a misleading sense of precision where we don't really have that. What I usually talk about is, and I showed that picture earlier, is body condition score, right? That's probably the best you can do. You want your dog to be pretty darn lean, right? You want to feel the ribs, you want to have a waistline. You know, it's going to depend on their conformation and their size. You know, if you have a pug, they're going to look different than if you have a greyhound or something. But the bottom line is, you want people at the park to come up to you and go, gosh, is your dog all right? He's really skinny. Because our image in our head is overweight dogs. My office mate in the hospital has a lab of the day calendar, and every lab on that calendar is grossly obese. That's what we're accustomed to seeing. And how you get there will depend. I absolutely I've most of my life had big dogs, and you have to watch them like a hawk, because they will eat everything and gain weight like nobody's business. And for a variety of personal reasons, I ended up with a couple of little rescue mutts about 18 pounds. I just leave the food out, and they eat what they want, and they are skinny as all get out, and I don't have to worry about it. And that's just a behavioral difference, and I don't have an explanation for it. But, you know, as long as they're that body weight, I don't keep track of what I feed like I used to for my labs, because I don't have to worry about it. They're nice and skinny and nice and healthy, and they all end up living into their mid-late teens. So it's working. So yeah, I mean, you have to take the information with a grain of salt, and that's my best suggestion is look at your dog and see what they look like. And that's probably as close as you're going to get right now.
Quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
My dog's, I don't know where he got the fanciness from. I don't know how he's so like me. I don't get it, but he turns up his nose at, say, day-old chicken. He wants fresh boiled chicken at night, and usually we count it like 2 to 3 drumsticks. We usually give him the 2, see how he feels.
Yeah.
He's still like trying to get more, then we give him the 3rd. But yeah, I think the question from Amy is great in the chat, which is similar to what I'm trying to ask right now, which is difference of, you know, I guess processed foods, right? Things that come in a bag versus I would consider freshly made, where we're actually cooking and serving.
Yeah. So 2 things there. First off, just in terms of how you decide how much they want to eat. And again, Emma will tell you this, dogs have nothing in the last 10,000 years to do but learn how to manipulate us. That's their survival skill, right? That's what they do. They watch us and they manipulate us, and we give them food, right? So be wary, because they're really good at understanding how we work and using that. So sometimes it's a little tricky to look at your dog. I mean, and I just say that from so many people who come in with overweight dogs, and he's starving, he's hungry all the time. I'm like, he's got nothing to do but get food from you, but his body is telling you something too. So anyway, in terms of different kinds of food, so here's what I can tell you. We know a lot about dog nutrition from the point of view of preventing obvious deficiencies and abnormalities. You know, we don't have a lot of dogs walking around with rickets or really gross nutritional deficiencies. And so pretty much any of the mainstream normal commercial diets will achieve that goal. You're not going to end up with something really awful happening. And a lot of the stuff about how the diets are all poisonous and terrible is just nonsense. That's not true. We feed them to millions and millions of dogs, and we have good data on that. What we don't know is what is the optimal diet for dogs in general, and what is the optimal or perfect diet for any individual dog. That I don't think we know. And I think anyone who says they know is expanding upon a hypothesis, not really relying on data. So in humans, there's a very clear difference between what we call processed foods and fresh foods. And processed foods for humans mostly means snack foods and convenience foods. These are things that are designed to taste good and feel good in your mouth and are marketed to you, you know, like a drug product, right? I mean, you know, the manufacturer's main concern is to get you to buy and eat their stuff repeatedly, right? There's no health concern involved there. No one's selling you potato chips to make you healthy, right? Processed foods or packaged foods for dogs are not the same thing as potato chips, right? Because there's a whole group of nutritionists and a whole industry devoted to figuring out if those things have health benefits or health risks. So it's a little bit of a problem to say, well, they're cooked and they come in a bag, so they're the same thing. Human snack foods and commercial dog foods are not the same thing. Definitely human snack foods are terrible and should be avoided. And for the most part, commercial dog foods are reasonable for most people in most situations. We also do know that there are definite health advantages to fresh foods in human beings, and I suspect there probably are in dogs as well. So I think that's the direction we're going to go in. My problem is that nobody's bothered to prove it yet. And so you look at something, I recommend a lot of just food for dogs for people who want to feed something because, I know the nutritionist who consults for the company and I know that she's paying attention. They had some real bad formulation problems and they fixed those. So, I'm a fan of the idea of fresh foods, but I'm still waiting for some data, and there's a whole lot more marketing than there is data. So you just have to take it all with a grain of salt. If you're cooking for yourself, it's the same thing. I think home cooked diets are fantastic if you can put the time and the work in. So you got to talk to a nutritionist, you got to get it formulated, you got to make sure you're consistent. If you accidentally substitute one thing for another, you're probably changing the nutrient profile and you don't even know it. So it's a lot of work, but I think it's a great option if you want to put that work in. About the only thing that I really tell people I don't think you should do is raw diets. And there might even be health benefits to those. That, again, nobody's gotten around to proving. It's all anecdote. But I know there are health risks. I mean, we do see dogs coming in with salmonella and E. coli, and we do see people getting infectious diseases from the raw meat and the pet food. So I don't think at this point there's enough benefit proven to be worth the risk. But I think probably fresh cooked foods is where we're eventually going to be going. We just somebody needs to do the research, and it's so much easier to make and sell a product than to do the research that we're waiting for that to happen.
Here's a softball. Vegan dogs, go.
In general, if you say cats, I'd say no, that's crazy. If you say dogs, they're omnivores. What have they been eating? They've been eating our table scraps for 10,000 years. You look at their GI tract, you look at their salivary amylase, you look at the genes for starch digestion. They're not the same as wolves. So I think if it's carefully formulated by a nutritionist, you could probably get away with it, and it's probably okay. I'm not convinced there's an advantage from a health point of view either, so I don't know if it's worth the trouble. There might be some, I'm a vegetarian, there might be some advantages from an ecological point of view, but from a health point of view, I don't know if it's worth the trouble, but yeah, I think you can probably do it if you do it right.
Can I do a follow-up on that question for
Yeah.
people who do want to try to feed vegetarian or vegan with their dogs?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of supplementation are they needing to do? I know for humans, going vegan means you got to be thinking about magnesium and those kinds of things. Are there supplementations that they should be aware of and considering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why I say, either you're going to be feeding a commercial diet that comes from a company that pays a nutritionist. I mean, that's the bottom line. I don't care if it's a big company, small company, I don't care who it is, but they need to pay a nutritionist to make sure their formulation is complete, and they need to do batch testing. They need to test each batch to make sure that it's still complete. Even the big companies who do all of that make mistakes sometimes, that we all know about the thing with Hills and the vitamin D. They took the mix of vitamins in from their supplier and they didn't test it. They just trusted that it was what it was supposed to be, and it wasn't, right? So the easiest way to go is to find a commercial company that does those things, and you might have to call them and ask, do you have a boarded nutritionist who formulates? Do you test every batch? That kind of thing. If you want to do it yourself, then again, I would talk to a nutritionist, and they will probably put together a list of supplements. And you do have to be aware of things like bioavailability. So not all the supplements that we'll get for ourselves are necessarily going to work for our dogs. So it's complicated, but yeah, no, there definitely are things you'll need to add in. People often tell me about their homemade diets, and, it never occurs to them that feeding pure organ meat, for example, is calcium deficient. And so then if there's no bone meal, there's no calcium in it. So, it turns out to be more complicated. We get away with eating pretty much whatever we want. So we think that that's okay, but it turns out to be a little bit of work to feed your dog properly that way. But I think it can be done. Yeah.
What commercial dog foods do you recommend to your patients?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of brand loyalty, to be honest, because I think that, again, we're in the situation where the vast majority of them are probably fine and none of them are probably perfect. And so, again, what I suggest to people is a company that has an established track record, that has a nutritionist, that batch tests each batch of food. And with that said, your dog is different from my dog, is different from Emma's dog, and they're all going to be a little different. I fed my two dogs, I think it was a Purina product, for 16 years. And I started with exactly the same food with my next dog, and his poop was awful. And I had to try something else because he's different and his needs were different. And so I don't particularly recommend brands, and there are very few that I recommend against. Some of the really small companies that make really exaggerated health claims make me nervous. And so I tend to be wary of those. If you guys are interested, particularly in nutrition, I think one of the greatest books, and I encourage everyone to get it, is called Dog Food Logic. And that is a really, really nice discussion of sort of the pet nutrition world from a scientific point of view and also from a practical point of view, what it takes, regulatory sense and a business sense to make a dog food. It's really difficult to judge the quality of the dog food. What's on the label is not the information we probably need on the label to make reasonable judgments about it. Even just figuring out the calorie content is hard, because are you talking about dry matter as fed, as percent metabolizable energy? I mean, it turns out it's really, really difficult to get good information. And you often, if you're really dedicated, you have to nag companies to get the information you need. But the bottom line is also that the overwhelming majority of my patients are fed sort of mainstream commercial diets, and I don't see any evidence that those are causing widespread dramatic health problems either. So I think part of the issue with nutrition and diet is it's a thing that we control, right? And so we want to make it perfect because it's the thing that we can do to have, an effect on the health of our pets. But, we don't know what perfect is yet. And sometimes, we get a little crazed in our search for perfect.
I have a quick follow-up to that. I know we're talking a lot about diet today, but I'm also curious about exercise, and both physical but also mental exercise. We talked a lot about cognitive decline in Emma's class, and it's just kind of stayed with me.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about that and enrichment. So I'm curious how that relates to aging, and I guess if not preventing, at least pausing that aging process of the brain and of the limbs too.
Yeah, I mean, exercise is huge. It is, probably on a par with, or maybe slightly behind, some of the dietary things in terms of human health. I mean, we all know that except for the absolute most insane and extreme events, the more you do, the better, and none of us do nearly enough. So exercise is huge. And we know a lot about the physiology of that. I was just reading this long, complicated paper about how exercise increases the inflow of glucose into your muscles, which reduces your insulin levels, which have long-term effects on inflammatory. I mean, it does a lot of really, really good things for your overall health as one of those, moderate stressors. So there's no question that it reduces morbidity and extends both health span and lifespan in people dramatically. It probably does in dogs. I can think of no reason why it wouldn't also do the same thing in dogs. There's not much in the way of research on that. There's some lab studies looking at training effects, and they have the same training effects as people do. So, the more they exercise, the fitter they get metabolically and in terms of aerobic fitness. So I can think of no reason why it wouldn't also be true for dogs, but nobody has really sat down and looked at sedentary dogs versus active dogs and said, how are their health outcomes different? And I think we absolutely should do that, because I think if we can get that evidence, we'll be able to convince people to do more activity, which I think is important. And that's, strictly from a physical health point of view. But, brain aging is aging, just like heart and kidney aging are. And, we focus on neurodegenerative diseases a lot in humans, because now that we're getting better at controlling other things that kill us, this is the thing that we're having to live with and is a huge cause of morbidity and mortality in people. And aging is a tremendous part of that, protein misfolding and mitochondrial dysfunction, all the things that cause the rest of your body to age, cause your brain to age, and all the things that improve your aging profile for the rest of your body likely do the same for your brain as well. So I think that both physical activity unquestionably is going to be good for your brain and probably for your dog's brain. And it's a little harder to know. I mean, I think there's no doubt in people that intellectual activity, that things you do behaviorally with your brain, preserve function and capacity. Again, I can think of no reason why that won't be true for our dogs as well. They're incredibly smart creatures, and they're incredibly social creatures. And so their cognitive and their social environments are undoubtedly major, what we call socioeconomic or demographic health factors in terms of their risk. I'm not aware of a ton of evidence. There is a little bit specifically on cognitive dysfunction syndrome and certain kinds of behavioral tasks. So I think both of those things are probably true. The one other interesting thing to that is a little bit of research in sled dogs. Sled dogs are an interesting model because they are sort of the extreme endurance athletes of the canine world. And if you look at them from a metabolic point of view, basically what you see is that kind of the adaptations they make for that kind of activity are essentially like caloric restriction. They're very much anti-aging kinds of metabolic shifts. And I think that that's a little bit of indirect evidence that exercise probably also has some of the same benefits that caloric restriction and some of the other things do. Again, just wish that I could have some actual studies to point to, but from a basic sort of biology point of view, there's no reason to think that the evidence in all these other species we've looked at doesn't apply to our dogs too.
Thank you. So folks, we have a couple more minutes. If anyone wants to jump in with any last questions, speak up now.
Can I ask a question? And this may be beyond kind of a little left of center, I don't know, but I'm wondering if you can explain the thing that I keep hearing lately, the relationship between telomere length and aging.
Mm-hmm.
What is that about?
Yeah, so telomeres are basically little caps on the end of your chromosomes. They're DNA, but they're non-coding. They don't have any genes. They don't produce any proteins or do anything. And we used to just think of them as junk. And for most species, not all, but for most species, they get shorter and shorter and shorter as you get older in most of your cells. Some of your cells, like your sperm and ovaries, for example, have an enzyme called telomerase, which helps to keep them longer. And cancer cells will sometimes develop that. And early on, there, probably back in the 70s, I think it was now, there was a relationship discovered between telomere length and the survival of cells in tissue culture. So cells tended to get shorter and shorter telomeres, and eventually their telomeres got to nothing and they died. And that led to this idea that telomere shortening was the primary driver of aging, right? Which became one of those, simple but wrong theories that we spent a lot of time chasing down. It turns out it's way more complicated than that. Telomere length is different in different species. It's different in different breeds of dog. There is a relationship between telomere length and lifespan, both across species and also within species. So larger dogs who live who live shorter lives tend to have shorter telomeres relative to smaller dogs who live longer lives. So, there are definitely relationships there. I think what the big debate now is about is that causal or not? Are the telomeres doing something useful? Or in this thing we call the Hayflick limit, where your cells can only divide so many times and then they're just done and they give up? Or is it simply a biomarker of aging? What we do know about telomeres is that they actually play a really, really significant role in cancer biology. And the ability of cells to become sort of immortal by changing how their telomeres work is an important feature of oncogenesis, of the development of cancers. That's probably more important in terms of what telomeres are doing than aging per se. So it's one of the hallmarks of aging. It's one of the things that's related, but we're beginning, I think, to see it more as a biomarker than a causal factor, except apart from the fact that it's involved in the causing of cancer, which is, of course, one of the big age-related diseases.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies that a lot. I kept hearing that, people talking about that, and I wasn't quite sure whether it was, as you say, a marker or a causal agent or something. Yeah, that's good to know. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else in the audience have any questions for Dr. McKenzie? Nope. Going one, going twice.
I'm jumping in because I was waiting.
All right, go for it.
Go for it.
First. This goes off of the telomere and senescence and cancer, but in a less technical way. So the lumps and bumps category, right? Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with the idea that if it's squishy and moves around, it's not attached to anything. It's probably just a lipoma. If it's a little harder and it seems like it's attached to something, make sure you get it aspirated, all that kind of stuff. Lucy is developing a lot of skin tag looking things. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, I don't want to be running her, especially because she's old enough. I probably wouldn't put her through like chemo mm-hmm. and that stuff. but at what point do you think about something that looks kind of like a skin tag being potentially cancerous versus just a skin tag?
Yeah. And this is a tough one because it's more about risk tolerance, right? So if you're an oncologist and you see all the weirdest things that hardly ever happen, you're going to say biopsy every damn one of those things, right? And I see oncologists who do that. I'm a general practitioner and I see all the common stuff and not nearly as much of the rare stuff. And I also know that doing a lot of tests in older animals finds things that are not clinically meaningful, but that cause a lot of anxiety, that cause a lot of additional invasive testing, that cause a lot of unnecessary treatments. You have to be a little careful about unleashing the testing juggernaut on your dog, which doesn't mean you don't want to do it, but it means you want to think carefully about when you do it. And so as a clinician, I have a little bit of an instinct about what looks worrisome and what doesn't look worrisome. And so, your vet will offer you that. They'll say, look, yeah, I think it looks like a skin tag. Can I absolutely guarantee you it's not a mast cell tumor? No. Is it probably not a mast cell tumor? Probably not based on that. And that's, that again, may be enough reassurance for you, or you may want to just get that biopsy or get that aspirate just to have that additional level of security. The other thing that I can tell you is, realistically, especially with an older dog, what's it doing? If it's been there for a year and it hasn't changed at all, whether it's cancerous or not, in a 16 or 14-year-old dog, it's probably not going to be a life-limiting or quality of life-limiting thing. And the costs both to your dog and to you of going through management for it may not be worth the benefits that you get out. I think those are just kind of general principles you apply to any kind of diagnostic and treatment process. Think realistically. And sometimes they'll be wrong. Sometimes they'll go, I think that's a skin tag. And, a month later, it's twice the size and darn it was cancer. But, as long as you've had that conversation, you're paying attention to it, you're thinking about, your goals and what's reasonable for you, I think that's okay. I think doctors get really, really worried about ever missing anything. And they end up doing things that maybe aren't in the best interest of the patient sometimes because of that anxiety. So yeah, I think you can't ever know for sure what it is, but it's perfectly reasonable to take that kind of risk-benefit balance approach to handling stuff like that. Because realistically, every older dog's going to walk in with 30 of those things. And I could make a little Franken dog patchwork quilt out of every one of them, but I don't think that's always in the best interest of every dog, right?
Thank you. That was great. And I actually think that's a great point to sort of close things out on, because I do think we tend to overdiagnose. That's my personal experience. And I know that bringing them to specialists, I have nothing against specialists. They're great. I appreciate them, but does tend to lead to this never-ending cycle of testing and more testing, and senior pets don't always appreciate that. So thank you so much, Brandon. This was wonderful. Such great information. I think people are dropping that in the chat as well. And I also just wanted to say, I was joking earlier about 5-10 years when you have some more answers for us, some drugs. I know it's such a long process, but I'm so glad that you and your team are working on this. These are such important questions. And as you mentioned, there are so many questions about our dogs that are not being looked at. So really, really grateful, not just on behalf of the community, but I think on behalf of dog parents, that you guys are going on this journey. And I know it sounds so cliche and hokey, but really, I think it's so meaningful and such important work. So thank you for coming here and sharing with us. And I'll send out even to our wider newsletter information about Loyal next week. So hopefully we'll get you some recruits out in California, or we do have some folks upstate as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure, no, it's great. It's a lot of fun, and you guys are welcome. You guys have my contact information. I'm always happy to chat or to questions, or if other things come up. It's great. Obviously, I'm excited about this stuff, so it's fun to talk about it.
Definitely. We'd love to have you back once you start doing studies, and love to stay up to date. You can tell, all dog nerds here, and we'd love to hear any in progress updates too if you have time.
You bet. You bet. All right. Well, take care, everybody. Nice to meet y'all.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
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 See you all very soon.